Hello everyone, how are you guys doing? I hope that you're all doing well. So today we're going to talk about free and competitive markets and social welfare. So before we start, I want to make a very quick clarification. So economists use the term free markets quite often, and you probably also have heard, of this term being used. So when they say free markets, what they're actually referring to is a free and a competitive market. So for their convenience, they drop the word competitive generally. It's a very long word, and they simply say free markets. So for the sake of clarity, on my slides, as you will see, I always wrote it out, free competitive markets, so that you will know exactly what we're talking about. But in daily speaking language, I might simply refer it as free markets. So I just wanted to clarify this before we begin. All right, so let's begin. So what is this whole thing is about? This whole thing goes back to the 18th century and to one particular man, this man called Adam Smith. So Adam Smith was a Scottish economist. He was also a philosopher and a political scientist. Back in those days, most of the researchers were doing research that are multidisciplinary in nature. Good times. So this brilliant economist has made significant contributions to the field of economics. He has several books. His most famous book is called Wealth of Nations. Many people consider this book as a book in which he laid out the foundations of classical economic theory. So because of the contributions that he has done to the field of economics, a lot of people call him the father of classical economics. Some people actually even call him the father or the founder of also capitalism because he's a free markets person, as you will see in a minute. So he's a brilliant economist. He's written about so many different topics, and he has lots of useful insights and interesting ideas. But he's generally most well known for two arguments that he has made in his books. The first one is that free competitive markets reach an equilibrium as if it is guided by an invisible hand. So what is referring to is what we discussed before. What it is simply saying is that if there is an imbalance in the market, imbalance between demand and supply, such that there's either a surplus or a shortage, then an invisible hand will come into the marketplace and move the market towards its stable equilibrium price point. So he made this observation. He didn't fully understand why exactly this is happening. So that's why he called it there's some invisible hand. And in fact, here implicitly it is referring to the hand of God actually. So nowadays, in modern economics, we fully understand the mechanism behind this process. It's just the demand and supply and the price adjustment process. Basically moves the markets, any market that is not in balance, if these forces will always move it towards its equilibrium point. Adam Smith's invisible hand, basically. So the first point he makes, it was remarkable that he was able to observe it back in the 18th century. So that has been an important contribution. And I would say this first point that he makes, this is quite uncontroversial. Old economists, also actually non-economists would agree that this is a process that is taking place in marketplace. Having said that, his second point, it remains to be controversial after, centuries actually. So in his book, in second point, he argues that a free and competitive market generates an outcome that is socially efficient. Sometimes we also call it allocatively efficient. And based on this argument, he continues to argue that if the markets are already competitive, so the government should never intervene. If they intervene, they're going to generate inefficiency. Put it differently, he argues that government interventions are justifiable only if it's about if these interventions are about making the market more competitive and therefore moving it towards its ideal benchmark. Okay, so now in the rest of this recording, I want to spend some time on this concept of allocative efficiency and also why Adam Smith thought that the free competitive markets is generating an outcome that is socially most efficient. Okay, allocative efficiency is defined as follows. An allocative efficient outcome is an outcome in which the total of consumer surplus and the producer surplus are maximized. The consumer surplus, as we discussed before, is the area under the demand curve which is bounded by the market price, and the seller surplus, the mirror image, meaning that it is the area, is a triangle, the area above the supply curve which is bounded by the price line, equilibrium price line. So this is the producer or seller surplus. So Adam Smith argued that the equilibrium that the free and competitive markets generate is basically maximizing the total of consumer surplus and the producer surplus. So I'm going to explain you why in a minute with simple case studies. But before doing that, I just have a mini discussion about this definition of allocative efficiency. 2 points here. One, as you can see, this definition of allocative efficiency is actually a little bit of a narrow definition. So if you think about, for instance, in the context of consumer surplus, so consumer surplus is basically a consumer's maximum is to pay minus the market price. So this is a little bit of a narrow in the sense that it doesn't really consider the consumer's overall well-being. For instance, the consumer might be consuming this product, but maybe her health is being negatively impacted, or there's some other side effects. So these are not taken into account basically in this definition. And the second point to highlight is that this definition of allocative efficiency only cares about the total surplus here. It doesn't really care about the distribution of it. In this particular example, it just happened to be that it is kind of like equally distributed, but you may imagine some cases, we're actually going to analyze them later in this course, that for instance, the consumer surplus is like tiny little bit and all the remaining surplus goes to producers, for instance. So under this allocative efficiency definition, as long as the total surplus is maximized, we will call the outcome allocatively efficient, sorry. And you may imagine that since the distribution effects are also important, so that's the second limitation of this definition as a social welfare criteria. Okay, now let's go back to our question. So Adam Smith argued that free competitive markets maximizes surplus. Let's ask, why is that the case? So to do so, I'm gonna, to show you why, I'm gonna do two cases. In the first case, I'm gonna ask, what would have happened if the market price was higher than the equilibrium price? And in the next slide, I'm gonna do the opposite case. What would have happened if the price was lower than the equilibrium price? Let's begin with this. So this is our equilibrium price, right? And now I'm gonna do a thought experiment. What would the total surplus in the market would have been if the market price was actually higher than the equilibrium price? All right, let's first look at the demand and supply under this new price. Under this new price, as you can see, because the price is high, now the quantity demand is gonna be a little bit lower. And because also the price is high, but this time the quantity supply is gonna be a little bit higher. If the supply is higher than the demand, we basically say there's a surplus. So right, there is an imbalance in the market. So under these new conditions, let's look at the consumer surplus and the producer surplus. Under this new allocation, the new consumer surplus is gonna be this area, this blue triangle. The reason for this is that it's only these customers, given the PM, it's only these customers who are willing to participate in the market, and they're gonna pay a price of PM. So therefore, this area, right, that distance is the consumer surplus for a given consumer who's willing to participate in the market, and the total is that blue triangle. What about the seller's surplus? From the seller's point of view, so now there's lots of units that are being supplied, but these sellers are only able to sell QD amount, right? Because the demand is relatively low. So these sellers are going to receive PM, and their minimum price to accept, right, to sell the product. So it is basically identified by this segment of the supply curve. So this distance here is going to give me the seller surplus. but this time it's not all the way going down, this point, because they are able to sell only QD number of units. I hope you're able to see this. And now, under the new conditions, this is the new producer surplus. And what happens to that tiny little triangle here? Well, this tiny triangle here is basically the deadweight loss that the market is realizing due to price being much higher than the equilibrium price. Conceptually, well, why is there a deadweight loss? You can see it on the graph, but also conceptually it's useful to understand why. Well, the idea here is that had the price been a little bit lower, right, it had been towards the equilibrium price here, then more consumers would have been willing to participate in this market. And when the more consumers are willing to participate, there are also suppliers who are willing to serve them. So there would have been some economic transactions basically taking place by those consumers and also the suppliers. And then once they participate in the market, then they would have enjoyed some surpluses. But because now, given the high price, they're excluded from the market, there's a deadweight loss associated with a particularly high price. So conceptually, that's why there's a loss. Okay, as you can see, basically, while under the free competitive market, the total surplus was the big triangle. Now it's only that weird shape, trapezoid, basically. Okay, what if the opposite scenario? What would have happened to the surpluses in the market if the price was lower than the equilibrium price? Again, let's begin with our benchmark case, which is the equilibrium price. And now the market price is a little bit, is lower than the equilibrium price. Now the new demand is gonna be high, right? Because the price is low, the demand is very high. But this time, the supply side, they're not really willing to supply that much. So the supply bid is gonna be binding. So the QS is gonna be much lower than the QD. If the supply is much lower than the demand, remember, so we call this shortage. So now the next question is that what is the new consumer surplus and what is the new producer surplus? So now there's a little bit of a tricky issue here. So we have a shortage problem. So which means there are lots of consumers who want to be able to access the product, right? But there are very limited number of units available. So when I want to calculate the consumer surplus, I'm going to do it under a hypothetical scenario. The hypothetical scenario here is that I'm going to assume that I'm going to allocate this the limited number of products available to the consumers who value it the most. Basically means that I'm going to give, there's only these QS units, right? I'm going to allocate to people who who value it the most. So this segment of the demand. So their maximum to pay for this product is higher than for the remaining customers. So I'm going to allocate to them. Great. So then if, by doing this, again, you might be questioning, in a theory, maybe you can do it, but in practice, what does it even mean? You can't really, implement such policy. And you're right, this may not be implementable in practice unless it's a communist regime. Perhaps you might be able to do in a communist regime, but outside a communist regime, this might be difficult. I agree. And here we're doing this just for calculation purposes, meaning that I'm going to calculate the highest possible consumer surplus by focusing on this hypothetical scenario, because I'm giving the product, the limited number of products with people who value it the most. So which basically means that under this scenario, I'm calculating the highest possible consumer surplus. If we can show that at the end of this analysis that even under this best case scenario, if total surplus in this market is still lower than what a free competitive market could generate, then we basically have a very strong case. Okay, so we're just making this assumption for the sake of developing the argument. So, all right, so I'm allocating all these limited number of units of product to these customers. Then the question is that what is the consumer surplus that they enjoy? Well, the consumer surplus that they enjoy is all of these people. They're going to end up paying only PM, right? So that means that now the consumer surplus is going to be that trapezoid. It's going to be fewer number of people who are going to be able to access the product, but the ones who can access, they enjoy a higher consumer surplus, as you can see from this figure. Great. Now, what about the seller surplus? Well, for the sellers, there are only QS number of sellers, right? They get PM, and the minimum price that they would accept is represented by the point on the supply curve. So basically meaning that that triangle, the greenish triangle, is basically the producer surplus. And what happens to that tiny little triangle here? Again, that is a deadweight loss due to price being too low. The idea is the same as before. There's a deadweight loss because had the price been a little bit higher, then there more consumers will be willing to, more sellers would have been willing to participate in the market and serve those customers who are not being served before. And some surpluses would have been enjoyed by both parties, but because they're now excluded from the market, so there's a deadweight loss. So as you can see, then going back to our allocative, free market equilibrium and allocative efficiency graph, as you can see, the only price point that maximizes the total surplus is the one in which we have the market equilibrium condition, which is that the demand is equal to supply. Okay, so Adam Smith was able to just, casually observe this, which is what is so remarkable about it, without using any mathematical tools. But after he laid out this intuition, and many economists have worked on this for centuries actually, and they were able to formulate and formally show that Adam Smith's intuition and insight about allocative efficiency, in fact, it holds even in the formal model. But the economists also discovered that by writing out a formal model to analyze this question, that this idea that free markets generates an allocative efficient outcome, this holds only under certain conditions, and these conditions are quite important conditions. So the first condition is that, well, as the name suggests, it should be a market that is perfectly competitive, meaning that it's a market in which there are many buyers and many sellers, and there are no seller has a particularly important advantage in the market, so that there isn't a single dominant player, for instance, who is setting up the market prices. So a perfect competition is a very important condition behind this idea of allocative efficiency. Second one is that for a free market to be allocatively efficient, there shouldn't be any externalities. Externalities basically means that when suppliers supply their products, they shouldn't be imposing negative externalities on others, for instance, who are not participating in the market. So, for instance, when sellers are, when producers are producing their products, they shouldn't be polluting the air. They shouldn't be damaging the water and the nature around them. So if there are such negative externalities arising from the actions, then it's hard to talk about social welfare. And the third condition is perfect information. For a free and competitive market to generate a great outcome, it is a must that all the market participants are well informed. Everybody has access to information and they're able to interpret the available information, both on the buyers and the seller side. But of course, in real life, we know that there are important, information asymmetries. So, and the fourth condition, is that all the market participants are rational, so they don't make mistakes in their economic decisions. You can see that these conditions are quite, they're strong assumptions, and of course, in practice, we will see that actually they often fail. Because they often fail, it's actually, the whole idea of free markets generating the best outcome from a social welfare point of view, it can be a little bit naive. And as I explained in the very beginning in my introductory video, in this course we're going to focus on these market failures, And so we're gonna dig into the mechanism of each, and then we're gonna discuss the potential solution mechanisms. So in this course, we're gonna pretty much focus on the first three, because the last one, so the whole rationale of the thing, starting from mid-90s, a new field of economics emerged. That new field of economics is called behavioral economics. This whole new field is dedicated to understanding the economic implications of market participants not being fully rational. So if I get a chance, I will also touch upon this in this course, but we actually offering at Said a full course on behavioral economics. It's an elective course which is taught by my colleague Pedro Bordalo. Since we already have like a full course dedicated to behavioral economics, in this course we're gonna focus on the first three items here, but not as much on the fourth one. All right, I think this is all I want to say for this recording. I hope you enjoyed this discussion, and thank you very much for watching.